You spend countless hours creating detailed plans only to watch them crumble the moment reality hits. Every strategic initiative you launch seems to encounter obstacles you never anticipated, while competitors with seemingly simpler approaches consistently outmaneuver you and capture the opportunities you thought were yours. I am Sun Tzu, the ancient strategist whose planning principles have guided victorious leaders for over 2,500 years. From ancient battlefields to modern boardrooms, what I discovered about strategic planning will transform how you approach every goal, giving you the ability to create plans so robust they turn unexpected challenges into competitive advantages. The same principles that allowed me to win wars before they were fought can help you master the art of planning in ways that make success inevitable rather than accidental. Whether you're planning a career move, a business strategy, or a life transformation, the fundamentals of strategic thinking remain as powerful today as they were on ancient Chinese battlefields. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to master the art of strategic planning. Let me take you back to ancient China during the spring and autumn period, when I first understood that most people approach planning backwards. I was born into a world where kingdoms rose and fell with alarming frequency, where today's ally became tomorrow's enemy, and where survival depended not on strength alone, but on the wisdom to see what others could not. As a young man, I witnessed countless military campaigns that should have succeeded, but ended in devastating failure. I watched powerful armies with superior numbers, better weapons, and more resources march confidently into battle, only to be utterly destroyed by smaller, seemingly weaker forces. At first, like everyone else, I attributed these outcomes to luck, divine intervention, or the mysterious nature of warfare itself. But I was curious in a way that troubled my teachers. While others accepted these defeats as inevitable uncertainties of war, I began studying them obsessively. I collected accounts from survivors, examined the terrain where battles were fought, and interviewed commanders from both winning and losing sides. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about success and failure. The bronze war tablet that I kept during those early years became my most treasured possession, not because it was valuable, but because it contained the first systematic records of what actually determined victory. Most people, I realized, planned for what they hoped would happen rather than what was likely to occur. They made decisions based on their desires rather than reality. I remember the moment my understanding crystallized. I was observing a battle between two neighboring states, positioned on a hill overlooking the valley where the armies would meet. The larger force had everything in their favor: numbers, equipment, morale, and even the support of the local population. Their general had planned meticulously, accounting for supplies, weather, and troop movements. Yet as I watched the battle unfold, I saw that superior force lose decisively. The smaller army had done something the larger one had not. They had planned not just for their own actions, but for their enemies' reactions. They had positioned themselves so that every move their opponent made would only strengthen their own advantage. They had turned the very size of the opposing army into a liability. That's when I understood that strategy is not about overpowering your challenges, it's about positioning yourself so that your challenges work in your favor. The winning general had not fought harder, he had fought smarter. He had planned in a way that made his victory almost inevitable before the first sword was drawn. From that day forward, I began developing what would become my life's work, a systematic approach to strategic thinking that could be applied to any situation, whether on the battlefield or in the countless other arenas where people compete for limited resources and opportunities. I learned that most people confuse activity with progress. They create elaborate plans filled with detailed actions, timelines, and resource allocations. but they failed to address the fundamental question: how do we position ourselves so that success becomes the natural outcome of our efforts rather than a fortunate accident? This realization would guide everything I taught about the art of war, and everything I want to share with you about the art of strategic planning in your own life. The mirror of self-assessment that I carried with me was not merely a tool for grooming. It became the symbol of the most difficult yet essential skill in strategic planning: brutal honesty about your own capabilities. I learned early that every failed plan I had witnessed began with the same fundamental error. The planner had based their strategy on who they wished they were, not who they actually were. I remember my first command when I was put in charge of a small garrison defending a mountain pass. I was young, ambitious, and convinced of my own brilliance. I had studied every military treatise available and believed I understood warfare better than the veteran soldiers under my command. When enemy forces approached, I devised what I thought was a masterful defensive strategy. My plan failed catastrophically within hours, not because it was poorly conceived in theory, but because I had overestimated my troops' training, underestimated the time required for complex maneuvers, and completely misjudged my own ability to maintain clear communication. Under pressure, I had planned for an ideal version of my forces rather than the reality of what we could actually accomplish. That humbling defeat taught me that successful strategic planning must begin with unflinching self-assessment. I developed a systematic approach to understanding my true position, which I came to call the 5 mirrors of reality. Each mirror reflected a different aspect of my actual capabilities versus my perceived ones. The first mirror showed my resources, not what I hoped to have or what I deserved to have, but what I actually possessed at that moment. I learned to count only the soldiers who were present, equipped, and ready to fight, not those who might arrive or who appeared strong but were actually unreliable. The second mirror revealed my skills, the things I could do well consistently under pressure, not the abilities I possessed in ideal conditions. I had to acknowledge that there were many military tactics I understood intellectually but could not execute effectively when chaos erupted around me. The third mirror exposed my limitations, the boundaries of my knowledge, experience, and judgment. This was perhaps the most difficult mirror to look into, as it required admitting areas where I was weak or inexperienced rather than pretending competence I did not possess. The fourth mirror showed my true motivations, not the noble purposes I proclaimed publicly, but the genuine desires that drove my decisions when no one was watching. Understanding these hidden motivations was crucial because they would unconsciously influence my strategic choices. The fifth mirror reflected my actual relationships and influence, not the loyalty I assumed people felt toward me, but the trust and commitment I had actually earned through my actions. I discovered that most people avoid this level of self-examination because it is uncomfortable. They prefer to plan based on optimistic assumptions about their capabilities, rather than realistic assessments. But I learned that this discomfort is temporary, while the consequences of self-deception in strategic planning can be permanent. When I began applying this rigorous self-assessment to my planning, something remarkable happened. My strategies became dramatically more effective, not because I had become stronger or more skilled, but because I was finally working with accurate information about my actual position. I could design plans that leveraged my real strengths while accounting for my genuine limitations. This principle applies to every area of modern strategic planning. Whether you are planning a career change, building a business, or pursuing any significant goal, success depends first on honest evaluation of your current position. You must know your actual skills, resources, relationships, and limitations before you can craft a strategy that has any hope of succeeding in the real world. The terrain map of opportunity that I developed became one of my most powerful strategic tools, but it took me years to understand that the environment you operate in shapes your strategy more than your own capabilities do. Most planners focus intensely on their own strengths and weaknesses while remaining surprisingly ignorant about the conditions that will determine whether those strengths matter at all. I learned this lesson during a campaign in the southern provinces, where I was tasked with defending against a series of raids by mountain tribes. My initial strategy was sound in theory, had positioned my forces to protect the most valuable targets and established patrol routes that should have provided early warning of attacks. Yet the raids continued successfully, and I could not understand why my well-planned defenses were failing. The breakthrough came when I stopped analyzing my own positions and began studying the environment from my opponent's perspective. I spent days in the mountains, observing the terrain, weather patterns, and local customs. What I discovered transformed my understanding of strategic planning forever. The raiders were not simply attacking randomly. They were reading environmental signals that I had completely missed. They struck during specific weather conditions when visibility was poor, used mountain paths that were invisible to valley dwellers, and timed their attacks to coincide with local festivals when my soldiers' attention was divided. They understood their environment so thoroughly that they could predict my responses before I made them. I realized that I had been trying to impose my strategy on the environment rather than adapting my strategy to work with environmental forces. Once I began planning with the terrain, weather, and local customs as allies rather than obstacles, my defensive strategy became overwhelmingly effective. The raids stopped not because I had become a better general, but because I had finally learned to read the environment as skillfully as my opponents did. This taught me that every strategic situation has an environmental complex set of conditions, forces, and patterns that exist whether you acknowledge them or not. In ancient warfare, this meant understanding terrain, weather, and seasonal cycles. In modern strategic planning, it means understanding market conditions, cultural trends, technological changes, and the countless other forces that influence whether your plans will succeed or fail. I developed a systematic approach to environmental analysis that I called reading the invisible battlefield. Most people see only the obvious features of their strategic environment, the competitors they know about, the resources that are clearly available, the obstacles that are immediately visible, but the real strategic advantages come from perceiving the subtle patterns, hidden connections, and emerging changes that others miss. The first step is learning to observe without prejudice. Most people see only what confirms their existing beliefs about their environment. They notice information that supports their preferred strategy while unconsciously filtering out signals that suggest different approaches might be necessary. Second step is understanding that environments are dynamic, not static. The conditions that make a particular strategy effective today may change tomorrow. Unsuccessful planners must constantly monitor these shifts, rather than assuming that yesterday's environmental analysis remains valid. The third step is recognizing that you can influence your environment, but you cannot control it. The most effective strategies work with environmental forces rather than against them, finding ways to make natural trends and existing conditions support your objectives. When I began applying these principles, I discovered that superior environmental intelligence often mattered more than superior resources. A smaller force that understood the environment better could consistently defeat larger forces that operated with incomplete or outdated environmental knowledge. This same principle drives success in modern strategic planning, whether you are navigating career advancement, building a business, or pursuing personal goals. The network of spies scroll that I maintained throughout my career was more than a collection of names and contacts. It represented my understanding that superior information creates more strategic advantage than superior force. I discovered that most strategic failures stem not from poor execution, but from making decisions based on incomplete, inaccurate, or outdated information. My education in intelligence gathering began with a painful lesson. Early in my career, I was preparing to defend a city against what my scouts reported was a modest enemy force. Based on their information, I deployed a standard defensive strategy appropriate for the threat level they described. When the attack came, however, I faced an army 3 times larger than reported. Using siege equipment my scouts had somehow missed entirely. The city fell within 2 days. As I reflected on this disaster, I realized that I had treated information gathering as a minor preliminary task rather than the foundation of strategic planning. My scouts had told me what I wanted to hear rather than what they had actually observed, and I had accepted their reports without verification because they supported my preferred strategy. From that humiliation, I began developing what became my most valuable strategic asset, a systematic approach to gathering, verifying, and analyzing information that would give me decisive advantages over opponents who relied on assumptions, rumors, or wishful thinking. I learned that there are 3 types of strategic intelligence, each serving a different purpose. The first is current intelligence, accurate information about present conditions. This includes knowing your opponent's actual capabilities, resources, and immediate intentions rather than relying on speculation or outdated assessments. The second is predictive intelligence, information that helps you anticipate future changes and opportunities. This requires understanding the forces and trends that will shape tomorrow's strategic environment, not just today's conditions. The third is deceptive intelligence, understanding what your opponents believe about you and your capabilities. This knowledge allows you to control their strategic assumptions and lead them into making decisions that serve your purposes rather than theirs. I established networks of informants throughout every region where I might campaign, but these were not simply spies gathering secrets. They were carefully selected individuals who understood what information was strategically valuable and how to verify its accuracy. I taught them to distinguish between facts and interpretations, between what they observed directly and what others told them. More importantly, I learned to create multiple independent sources for any critical information. A single source, no matter how reliable, could be mistaken, compromised, or deliberately deceptive. By developing several unconnected sources for the same intelligence, I could identify discrepancies and piece together more accurate pictures of strategic situations. I also discovered that the most valuable intelligence often comes from sources that others ignore. While my opponents focused on gathering information from obvious sources, captured soldiers, diplomatic contacts, and official communications, I found that merchants, farmers, and travelers often possessed crucial insights about economic conditions, popular sentiment, and logistical realities that formal intelligence networks missed. The key breakthrough in my intelligence methodology came when I realized that information without analysis is merely data. Raw intelligence becomes strategically valuable only when you can interpret its meaning, assess its reliability, and understand its implications for your strategic objectives. I developed protocols for validating information before acting on it, for distinguishing between information that required immediate action and intelligence that could be filed for future reference. I learned to recognize when apparent intelligence was actually disinformation designed to mislead me, and how to use such deceptive intelligence to my advantage by understanding what my opponents wanted me to believe. Most importantly, I understood that intelligence gathering is not a one-time activity, but a continuous process that must adapt as conditions change. The information that guides your initial strategy may become obsolete as situations evolve, and successful strategic planning requires constantly updating your intelligence picture rather than relying on initial assessments. The strategic position board that I used to teach my officers became the most requested artifact in my military academy, because it demonstrated a truth that most people find difficult to accept. Where you position yourself determines your outcome more than how hard you work once you begin. I spent years learning that the ancient saying, "Choose your battles," means far more than simply deciding when to fight. It means positioning yourself so that victory becomes inevitable before any battle begins. My understanding of strategic positioning crystallized during what became known as the Battle of the Three Rivers. I was facing an opponent with superior numbers, better equipment, and more experienced soldiers. By every conventional measure, I should have retreated and sought more favorable circumstances for engagement. Instead, I spent 3 days studying the terrain and enemy movements, looking for a position that would neutralize their advantages. I discovered that the three rivers converging in the valley created natural barriers that would prevent my opponent from using their numerical superiority effectively. More importantly, the seasonal flood patterns meant that, in 2 days, the water levels would rise enough to make retreat impossible for whichever army occupied the central valley. My opponent, focused on their immediate tactical advantages, had positioned their forces in what appeared to be the strongest location, the fertile valley floor with multiple escape routes. I positioned my smaller force on the surrounding hills, which appeared disadvantageous, because we would be fighting uphill if we attacked. However, I was not planning to attack. When the floods came, as I had predicted, my opponent's superior army found themselves trapped in rising water with limited mobility, while my forces controlled the high ground and all escape routes. The battle was over before it truly began. My opponents surrendered without significant fighting, not because my soldiers were braver or more skilled, but because I had chosen a position that made their defeat inevitable, regardless of their tactical abilities. This taught me that positioning is not simply about physical location. It is about choosing your circumstances, timing, and context so that your natural advantages are maximized while your disadvantages become irrelevant. Most people exhaust themselves fighting from poor positions because they focus on working harder rather than positioning better. I developed 5 principles of strategic positioning that apply to any competitive situation. The first principle is positional awareness, understanding not just where you are, but where everyone else is positioned and why those positions matter. Most people know their own location, but remain ignorant about the strategic significance of positioning. The second principle is positional patience, waiting for or creating the right position rather than acting from whatever position you currently occupy. This requires the discipline to delay action until circumstances align in your favor, even when external pressure demands immediate movement. The third principle is positional flexibility, maintaining the ability to shift positions as conditions change rather than becoming locked into static positions that may become disadvantageous. The best positions today may become traps tomorrow if you cannot adapt. The fourth principle is positional leverage, choosing positions that allow you to influence the positioning of others rather than simply reacting to their movements. Superior positioning enables you to control the strategic tempo and force opponents to respond to your initiatives. The fifth principle is positional invisibility, achieving advantageous positions without alerting opponents to your strategic intentions. The most powerful positions are often those that appear neutral, or even disadvantageous to casual observation. When I began teaching these positioning principles to other commanders, they initially resisted because positioning requires patience and subtle thinking, while most people prefer direct action and obvious displays of strength. However, those who mastered positional strategy consistently achieved victories that appeared almost effortless to outside observers. The same principles that governed military positioning apply to modern strategic planning in careers, business, and personal development. The sundial of perfect timing that I kept in my command tent served as a constant reminder that even the most brilliant strategy fails if executed at the wrong moment. I learned through painful experience that timing transforms adequate plans into extraordinary victories, while poor timing can turn masterful strategies into devastating defeats. My education in strategic timing began with what should have been a simple river crossing. My scouts had identified the perfect location: shallow water, firm banks, and excellent defensive positions on the far side. My strategy was sound, my troops were prepared, and the enemy was positioned exactly where I wanted them. Yet, when we attempted the crossing, we suffered heavy casualties and nearly lost the entire force. What I had failed to account for was timing. I had planned the crossing during what appeared to be ideal weather conditions, but I had not considered the seasonal patterns that local farmers knew instinctively. The spring snowmelt, still weeks away in the mountains, would soon transform that gentle river into a raging torrent. More critically, my opponent had timed their positioning to coincide with these natural cycles. Knowing that weather patterns would force me into predictable movements, that near disaster taught me that timing in strategic planning involves far more than simply choosing when to act. It requires understanding the natural rhythms and cycles that govern your strategic environment, recognizing when conditions are aligned for your success, and having the patience to wait for optimal moments rather than acting from impatience or external pressure. I discovered that there are 3 types of strategic timing, each requiring different skills and awareness. Natural timing involves understanding the cycles and patterns that exist independent of human activity's seasonal changes, economic cycles, technological evolution, and cultural shifts that create windows of opportunity and vulnerability. Competitive timing focuses on the rhythms and patterns of your opponent's understanding when they are strong and when they are weak, when they are prepared and when they are distracted, when they expect action and when they are vulnerable to surprise. Created timing involves your ability to influence the pace and rhythm of strategic interactions, accelerating or delaying developments, to ensure that multiple factors align in your favor simultaneously. The most powerful strategic timing combines all 3 elements. I learned to study natural cycles until I could predict when environmental conditions would favor my objectives. I observed my opponents until I understood their patterns of strength and vulnerability. Then I developed the ability to accelerate or delay my own actions to ensure that natural timing, competitive timing, and my strategic objectives converged at the same moment. Surprise, I discovered, is not about doing the unexpected. It is about acting when your opponents are unprepared for any action at all. The most effective surprises come not from unusual tactics, but from perfect timing that catches opponents during their moments of weakness or distraction. I remember a campaign where I achieved complete surprise, not by hiding my movements, but by attacking during a religious festival when my opponent's attention was focused on ceremonial obligations. They knew where my army was located. They understood my strategic objectives, but they did not expect action during a time when military activities traditionally ceased. The element of surprise multiplies the effectiveness of any strategic action. A mediocre strategy executed with perfect timing and complete surprise often succeeds where a brilliant strategy executed predictably fails. This is because surprise disrupts your opponent's preparation and forces them to respond reactively rather than according to their own strategic plans. However, I learned that surprise is a diminishing asset. Once you have surprised an opponent successfully, they become more vigilant and harder to surprise again. Therefore, the element of surprise must be used strategically for moments when it can create decisive advantages rather than wasted on minor tactical gains. The granary ledger that I maintained throughout every campaign became my most valuable strategic tool. not because it tracked supplies, but because it taught me that resource management determines victory more than tactical brilliance. I learned, through costly mistakes, that most strategic failures result not from poor planning, but from misallocating limited resources across too many objectives without adequate reserves for unexpected opportunities. My most humbling lesson in resource allocation came during a prolonged siege where I commanded the attacking force. My initial strategy was comprehensive simultaneous assaults on multiple sections of the enemy walls, extensive siege equipment, and elaborate supply lines to support extended operations. On paper, the plan appeared overwhelming and should have succeeded quickly. Instead, the siege dragged on for months, draining my resources while the defenders grew stronger. I had spread my forces too thin across multiple objectives, leaving insufficient concentration at any point to achieve decisive breakthrough. More critically, I had committed all available resources to the initial assault, leaving no reserves to exploit opportunities when they arose or to respond to unexpected challenges. The siege finally succeeded, but only after I abandoned my comprehensive approach and concentrated overwhelming force at a single point. By consolidating resources that had been scattered across multiple secondary objectives, I achieved in days what months of dispersed effort had failed to accomplish. This experience taught me the fundamental principle of strategic resource allocation. Concentrate superior resources at decisive points rather than adequate resources at multiple points. Most people fail strategically because they try to do too many things adequately rather than doing the most important things overwhelmingly well. I developed what I called the 3 laws of strategic resources to guide all future planning. The first law states that every resource committed to a secondary objective is a resource unavailable for primary objectives. This seems obvious, yet most planners consistently underestimate the opportunity cost of resource dispersion. The second law requires maintaining strategic reserves, never committing all available resources to initial plans, regardless of how promising those plans appear. I learned to hold back 20% of my forces and supplies for unexpected opportunities or unforeseen challenges, even when immediate pressures demanded total commitment. The third law emphasizes resource multiplication through strategic partnerships rather than resource consumption through independent action. I discovered that borrowing or sharing resources often created more strategic power than attempting to accumulate resources independently. Resource conservation became equally important as resource allocation. I learned that maintaining momentum while conserving strength requires careful balance between aggressive action and prudent restraint. The most successful campaigns were those where I achieved maximum impact with minimum resource expenditure, preserving strength for subsequent strategic objectives. I developed systems for distinguishing between essential resources that directly supported strategic objectives and convenient resources that merely made operations more comfortable. Under pressure, I could rapidly identify which resources were truly necessary and which could be abandoned without compromising strategic effectiveness. This discipline of resource focus extended beyond material supplies to include time, attention, and energy. I learned that human resources, including my own mental and physical capabilities, required the same careful allocation and conservation as material resources. Strategic planning must account for the limited nature of all resources, not just the obvious ones. The most sophisticated aspect of resource management involved timing resource commitment to maximize impact. I learned to delay resource expenditure until the moment when those resources could create decisive advantages, rather than committing them early when their impact would be dispersed across multiple lesser objectives. These principles of resource allocation and conservation apply directly to modern strategic planning. Whether you are managing a business, advancing a career, or pursuing personal goals that require sustained effort over time. The flexible bamboo staff that I carried became my personal symbol of strategic wisdom. Because bamboo bends with the strongest winds yet never breaks, while rigid oak trees snap under pressures they cannot accommodate. I learned that the most beautiful strategic plans are worthless if they cannot adapt to changing conditions, and that survival often depends more on flexibility than on initial brilliance. My understanding of adaptive strategy was forged during what historians now call the Campaign of 7 Turns, where my original battle plan became obsolete 7 different times due to changing circumstances. Each time, commanders urged me to abandon the campaign entirely rather than continue with modified objectives. Each time, I chose adaptation over abandonment. The campaign began with a straightforward objective: capture a strategic mountain pass. Before winter weather made military operations impossible, my initial plan was elegant in its simplicity: rapid movement through friendly territory. Surprise attack on lightly defended positions. Establish winter quarters in captured fortifications. Within days, everything changed. Allied territories became hostile due to political shifts I had not anticipated. The supposedly light defenses proved to be elaborate traps designed to channel attackers into killing zones. Winter weather arrived weeks earlier than predicted, making my planned timeline impossible. Lesser commanders would have retreated, declaring the campaign impossible under changed conditions. Instead, I gathered my officers and explained what would become my core principle of adaptive strategy. We change our methods, never our ultimate objectives. Unless those objectives themselves become strategically irrelevant, I adapted the plan completely while maintaining the strategic goal. Instead of rapid movement through hostile territory, we used slow, careful infiltration. Instead of direct assault on prepared positions, we developed siege tactics appropriate for the actual defenses we faced. Instead of establishing winter quarters in captured fortifications, we prepared for mobile winter operations using local resources. Each adaptation required abandoning previous preparations and developing new capabilities quickly. This process taught me that flexibility in strategic planning requires building adaptability into your planning process, not just into your execution methods. I learned to distinguish between strategic principles that must remain constant and tactical methods that should change as circumstances demand. The principle of capturing the mountain pass remained valid regardless of changing conditions, but every method for achieving that principle required continuous adaptation. The most difficult aspect of adaptive planning is overcoming emotional attachment to original plans. I discovered that planners often resist necessary adaptations because they have invested significant time and energy in developing initial strategies. They prefer to fail with their original plan rather than succeed with a modified approach. Developed what I called the doctrine of strategic fluidity, the systematic approach to building adaptation into every strategic plan. This doctrine required preparing multiple alternative approaches for every strategic objective, establishing clear criteria for when adaptation was necessary, and training my officers to implement changes rapidly without losing strategic focus. The key insight was understanding that adaptation does not mean abandoning planning altogether. Random changes in response to every new development create chaos rather than flexibility. Effective adaptation follows systematic principles. Adapt methods while preserving objectives. Adapt quickly but deliberately, and ensure that adaptations strengthen rather than weaken your overall strategic position. I also learned to anticipate the need for adaptation by building contingency options into initial plans, rather than creating single-path strategies that required complete reconstruction when conditions changed. I developed branching strategies that could accommodate multiple scenarios without fundamental revision. The campaign of 7 turns ultimately succeeded, not because my original plan was brilliant, but because my willingness to adapt continuously allowed us to achieve our strategic objective, despite constantly changing circumstances. The mountain pass was captured, winter quarters established, and strategic goals accomplished through methods that bore no resemblance to my initial approach. This experience taught me that strategic flexibility is not a weakness or sign of poor planning. It is a sophisticated capability that allows superior strategists to succeed where rigid thinkers fail. The mask of mental warfare that I kept in my private quarters served as a constant reminder that the most important battlefield in any strategic contest exists in the minds of the participants. I discovered that understanding human psychology, your own and your opponents, determines strategic outcomes more than material advantages or tactical brilliance. My education in strategic psychology began with a devastating personal failure that taught me how emotions corrupt judgment. I was pursuing a rival general who had been raiding our territories with impunity. Every attack was a personal insult, every success of his an affront to my reputation. I was determined to destroy him quickly and decisively, to demonstrate my superiority for all to see. This emotional investment led me to abandon strategic discipline entirely. I pursued him into terrain that favored his forces, attacked when he was prepared and I was not, and committed resources carelessly because my wounded pride demanded immediate satisfaction. The campaign was a disaster that cost me valuable soldiers and damaged my reputation far more than his raids ever could have. As I reflected on this failure, I realized that my opponent had won not through superior strategy, but through superior psychological understanding. He had deliberately provoked my anger, knowing that emotional reaction would lead me to make poor strategic decisions. He had turned my own psychology against me, using my pride and impatience as weapons more effective than any siege engine. This humiliation taught me that strategic planning must account for the psychological dimensions of competition. Fear, greed, pride, anger, and desperation all influence decision-making in predictable ways. Leaders who understand these psychological patterns can anticipate opponent behavior and design strategies that exploit emotional vulnerabilities. I began studying the psychology of strategic decision-making. I learned that most people make strategic choices based on emotional impulses rather than rational analysis, then construct logical justifications for emotionally driven decisions. Understanding this pattern allowed me to predict opponent behavior with remarkable accuracy. Fear, I discovered, makes people overly cautious or recklessly desperate, depending on their personality and circumstances. Greedy opponents could be manipulated by creating apparent opportunities that were actually traps. Proud leaders could be provoked into making strategically unsound decisions to protect their reputation or demonstrate their superiority. More importantly, I learned to manage my own psychological state during strategic planning and execution. I developed practices for maintaining emotional equilibrium under pressure, for making decisions based on strategic logic rather than personal feelings, and for avoiding the psychological traps that my own emotions might create. The most sophisticated aspect of strategic psychology involved creating specific emotional states in opponents while maintaining clarity in myself. I learned to project confidence when I was actually vulnerable, to appear weak when I was strong, and to seem confused when I understood the situation perfectly. I discovered that the timing of psychological pressure was as important as the pressure itself. Applying psychological stress when opponents were already under other pressures multiplied its effectiveness, while the same tactics applied when opponents were calm and prepared had minimal impact. The key insight was recognizing that every strategic interaction involves multiple layers of psychological warfare. Surface communications convey obvious information, but underlying psychological messages often carry more strategic significance. Learning to read these psychological signals while controlling the signals you transmit provides enormous strategic advantages. I also learned that group psychology differs significantly from individual psychology. Armies, organizations, and teams develop collective emotional states that influence decision-making in ways that individual psychology cannot predict. Understanding and influencing group psychology became essential for strategic success in complex operations involving multiple participants. These psychological principles apply directly to modern strategic planning, where understanding motivation, fear, ambition, and group dynamics determines success in competitive environments. The Alliance Treaty seal that I carried became one of my most powerful strategic weapons, not because it represented formal agreements, but because it symbolized my understanding that no significant victory is achieved in isolation. I learned that the ability to build and maintain strategic partnerships often determines success more than individual capabilities or resources. My appreciation for strategic alliances developed through a campaign where I was dramatically outnumbered by a coalition of enemy states. My initial response was to seek direct military support from friendly kingdoms, but this traditional approach to alliance building proved insufficient. Even with allied military assistance, we remained outnumbered and outresourced by our opponents. The breakthrough came when I began thinking about alliances not as military partnerships, but as strategic relationships that could provide different types of advantages. Instead of seeking more soldiers, I began building alliances that would give me intelligence, economic leverage, diplomatic pressure, and strategic positioning. I formed an alliance with merchant guilds that gave me superior information about enemy movements and economic conditions. I established partnerships with local leaders in disputed territories, providing me with knowledge of terrain and popular sentiment. I created diplomatic relationships that isolated my enemies politically, even when they remained superior militarily. Most importantly, I learned to structure alliances so that partners benefited more from supporting my objectives than from opposing them. Rather than asking allies to sacrifice their interests for mine, I designed partnerships where their success required my success, creating sustainable strategic relationships. This approach taught me the fundamental principle of strategic alliances. Sustainable partnerships must serve the genuine interests of all participants, not just the immediate needs of one party. Alliances based on one-sided benefits inevitably collapse when circumstances change or better opportunities arise. I developed what I called the 5 pillars of strategic partnership to guide alliance-building efforts. The first pillar was mutual advantage, ensuring that every alliance created genuine value for all participants rather than exploiting temporary weaknesses or desperation. The second pillar was complementary, strength-seeking partners whose capabilities enhanced my strategic position while my capabilities enhanced theirs, rather than simply accumulating similar resources. The third pillar was shared vulnerability, understanding that the strongest alliances develop when partners face common threats that neither could handle alone, creating natural incentives for sustained cooperation. The fourth pillar was flexible commitment, structuring partnerships to evolve as circumstances change, rather than creating rigid agreements that become obstacles when strategic situations shift. The fifth pillar was strategic independence, maintaining the ability to pursue independent objectives while honoring alliance commitments, avoiding partnerships that created dangerous dependencies or strategic limitations. I learned that building effective alliances requires different skills than managing direct subordinates. Alliance partners must be influenced rather than commanded, persuaded rather than ordered, and motivated through shared benefits rather than hierarchical authority. The most sophisticated aspect of alliance Strategy involved timing, partnership, development to maximize strategic impact. I learned to identify when potential partners were most receptive to alliance proposals, when their circumstances created natural alignment with my objectives, and when alliance formation would provide maximum advantage in competitive situations. I also discovered that managing multiple simultaneous alliances requires careful attention to potential conflicts between partners' interests. The most successful alliance strategies created networks of mutually reinforcing partnerships rather than collections of separate, bilateral relationships. The key insight was understanding that alliance building is an ongoing strategic process, not a one-time diplomatic activity. Successful partnerships require continuous attention to changing partner needs, evolving strategic situations, and emerging opportunities for deeper cooperation. These principles of strategic partnership apply directly to modern success in business, career advancement, and personal development, where individual achievement increasingly depends on the ability to build and maintain productive relationships with others who can provide resources, opportunities, and support that individual effort alone cannot generate. The command banner system that I developed became legendary among my officers, not for its visual elegance, but because it solved the most persistent problem in strategic execution: the gap between brilliant planning and effective implementation. I learned that most strategic failures occur not because plans are poorly conceived, but because they are poorly communicated and inconsistently executed. My education in strategic communication began with a perfectly planned night attack that became a catastrophic disaster due to communication breakdown. The strategy was sound: infiltrate enemy positions under cover of darkness, coordinate simultaneous strikes at multiple points, create chaos and confusion that would enable a decisive victory with minimal casualties. Every element of the plan had been carefully thought through. The timing was perfect, the target selection was optimal, and the force allocation was precisely calculated. What I had not adequately planned was how to maintain coordination and communication during the confusion of nighttime combat. Within minutes of the attack beginning, my carefully coordinated assault devolved into chaos. Units lost contact with each other, officers could not communicate changes in tactics, and soldiers began executing different versions of the plan based on incomplete information. What should have been a swift victory became a confused melee that lasted until dawn, achieving only partial objectives at far higher cost than necessary. As I analyzed this failure, I realized that communication planning requires as much strategic attention as tactical planning. It is not enough to develop brilliant strategies. You must also design systems that ensure your strategic intent reaches every person responsible for implementation, and that feedback from implementation reaches strategic decision-makers quickly, enough to enable necessary adjustments. I began developing systematic approaches to strategic communication that addressed three distinct challenges. First, clarity of intent, ensuring that strategic objectives and priorities are understood consistently throughout the organization. Second, tactical flexibility, allowing implementation teams to adapt methods while maintaining strategic alignment. Third, feedback integration, creating rapid communication channels that enable strategic adjustments based on implementation realities. The command banner system became my solution for maintaining strategic communication during complex operations. Different banner combinations conveyed specific strategic intentions, tactical modifications, and priority changes that could be understood instantly across the entire force without requiring detailed verbal explanations that might be misunderstood or delayed. More importantly, I learned that effective strategic communication requires understanding your audience's perspective, capabilities, and constraints. Strategic plans developed at headquarters must be translated into actionable guidance that makes sense to people operating under very different conditions with different information and different pressures. I discovered that the most common communication failures in strategic implementation stem from assuming that others share your knowledge, priorities, and understanding of context. Effective strategic communication requires explicitly stating assumptions, clarifying priorities when conflicts arise, and providing sufficient context for implementation teams to make good decisions when circumstances change unexpectedly. The key breakthrough in my communication methodology came when I realized that strategic communication is not simply about transmitting information. It is about creating shared understanding and commitment. People implement strategies more effectively when they understand not just what they are supposed to do, but why they are doing it and how their actions contribute to larger strategic objectives. I developed protocols for ensuring that strategic communication remained clear and actionable under pressure when time was limited and conditions were chaotic. These protocols emphasized simplicity over sophistication, clarity over completeness, and speed over perfection. I also learned to design feedback systems that enabled rapid strategic adjustments based on implementation experience, while maintaining enough stability to prevent constant changes that would undermine execution effectiveness. These principles of strategic communication apply directly to modern leadership challenges, where success depends on translating strategic vision into coordinated action across complex organizations with diverse capabilities and competing priorities. The risk assessment compass that I carried into every campaign served as more than a navigational tool. It reminded me that strategic planning must prepare for multiple directions simultaneously, because the path you expect to take is rarely the path circumstances will allow. I learned that the difference between strategic wisdom and strategic recklessness lies in understanding what can go wrong and preparing for those possibilities without becoming paralyzed by them. My understanding of strategic risk developed through what nearly became the greatest disaster of my career. I was leading an expedition to secure tribute from distant provinces, a routine mission that should have been completed within 2 months with minimal resistance. My planning was thorough for the expected scenarios. I had calculated supply requirements, mapped optimal routes, and prepared for the level of resistance that similar expeditions had encountered. What I had not adequately considered was the cascading effect of multiple small problems occurring simultaneously. Unseasonable weather delayed our progress, reducing our supply margins. Political changes in allied territories forced route modifications that extended our timeline. Minor skirmishes that should have been easily resolved consumed more resources than anticipated because local conditions differed from our intelligence reports. Each individual problem was manageable, but their combination created a crisis that my planning had not anticipated. We found ourselves far from friendly territory, with insufficient supplies, facing stronger opposition than expected, and operating on extended timelines that compromised our strategic position. What had begun as a routine expedition became a desperate fight for survival. The expedition ultimately succeeded, but only because I was able to improvise solutions to problems I had not foreseen. This experience taught me that strategic planning must account not just for individual risks, but for the ways that multiple risks can interact to create emergent challenges that are greater than the sum of their parts. I began developing systematic approaches to risk assessment that I called the doctrine of strategic preparation. This doctrine required identifying not just obvious risks, but subtle vulnerabilities that could cascade into major problems under certain combinations of circumstances. The first element of strategic risk assessment involves threat identification, all the ways that your strategic plan could fail or encounter significant obstacles. This requires thinking beyond obvious dangers to include subtle environmental changes, psychological pressures, resource constraints, and coordination challenges that might not be immediately apparent. The second element focuses on probability, assessment, understanding which risks are likely to occur and which are merely possible. Strategic planning cannot prepare for every conceivable risk, so effective risk management requires focusing attention and resources on the most probable and most dangerous threats. The third element emphasizes impact analysis, evaluating how different risks would affect your strategic objectives and what level of damage they could cause. Some risks threaten minor delays or increased costs, while others could result in complete strategic failure. The fourth element involves interaction, mapping, understanding how different risks might combine or trigger each other to create compound problems that are more serious than individual risks would suggest. The most sophisticated aspect of strategic risk management involves developing contingency plans that can address multiple risks simultaneously, rather than creating separate responses for each individual threat. The best contingency plans are flexible enough to address various combinations of problems while remaining simple enough to implement under pressure. I learned that contingency planning must balance preparation with paralysis. Overplanning for risks can consume resources needed for primary objectives and create such complex backup systems that they become unmanageable during actual crises. The goal is prudent preparation, not perfect protection against every possible threat. I also discovered that the most effective contingency plans often involve creating additional options rather than simply preparing defensive responses. Instead of just planning how to minimize damage from risks, I learned to identify how apparent risks might actually create unexpected opportunities for strategic advantage. These principles of strategic risk assessment apply directly to modern planning challenges, where increasing complexity and rapid change create environments where multiple unexpected challenges can emerge simultaneously. The momentum wheel that I kept in my command tent became my most treasured strategic artifact, because it represented the most powerful force in strategic execution, the compound effect of sustained progress that transforms modest advantages into overwhelming superiority. I discovered that momentum is not simply a byproduct of success, it is a strategic asset that can be created, directed, and leveraged to achieve objectives that would be impossible through direct effort alone. My understanding of strategic momentum crystallized during what became known as the Lightning Campaign, where I conquered 3 fortified cities in succession using forces that should have been insufficient for any one of them. The secret was not superior tactics or overwhelming force, but my ability to create and maintain momentum that transformed each victory into the foundation for the next one. The campaign began with an attack on the weakest of the 3 cities, which we captured more quickly than anticipated due to careful preparation and favorable circumstances. Instead of consolidating this victory and resupplying for the next phase, I immediately redirected our forces toward the second target while the psychological impact of our first success was still fresh. The defenders of the second city were demoralized by news of the first city's rapid fall and convinced that resistance was futile against such an apparently unstoppable force. They surrendered after minimal fighting, allowing us to capture valuable supplies and reinforcements that actually strengthened our position for the final assault. By the time we approached the third and strongest city, our reputation had grown to legendary proportions. Rumors of our invincibility had spread faster than our actual movements, creating psychological pressure that weakened defender morale before we arrived. The final siege succeeded not because we had overwhelming force, but because momentum had transformed us into a force that appeared overwhelming. This experience taught me that momentum multiplies the strategic value of every action, while its absence makes even simple objectives difficult to achieve. Success creates psychological and material conditions that make additional success more likely. while failure creates conditions that make recovery more difficult. I learned that strategic momentum operates through three distinct mechanisms. Psychological momentum affects the confidence and morale of your forces, while undermining opponent resolve. Material momentum occurs when successes provide resources and capabilities that enable larger successes. Positional momentum develops when achievements improve your strategic situation in ways that create new opportunities. The most important insight was understanding that momentum must be created intentionally, rather than hoped for accidentally. I developed systematic approaches to momentum building that began with careful selection of initial objectives. The first actions in any strategic campaign must be chosen not just for their immediate value, but for their potential to generate momentum for subsequent actions. I learned to identify momentum indicators, signs that strategic progress was accelerating, rather than simply continuing. These indicators included opponent behavior changes, resource accumulation rates, alliance formation patterns, and psychological shifts that suggested compound effects were beginning to operate. Creating momentum requires accepting calculated risks to maintain forward progress rather than consolidating gains prematurely. The temptation after any success is to pause, reorganize, and prepare thoroughly for the next phase. However, momentum dissipates quickly during periods of inactivity, often making careful preparation counterproductive if it allows momentum to disappear. I also discovered that maintaining momentum requires different skills than creating it initially. Sustained momentum demands consistent progress without overextension, careful resource management to avoid exhaustion, and tactical flexibility to adapt methods while maintaining strategic direction. The most sophisticated aspect of momentum strategy involves timing momentum application for maximum strategic impact. I learned to build momentum during periods when opponents were vulnerable and to apply maximum pressure when momentum effects would create decisive advantages. Momentum can also work against you if strategic direction is incorrect. Accelerating toward the wrong objectives simply creates faster failure. So momentum strategies must be based on sound strategic foundations rather than substituting speed for wisdom. These principles of strategic momentum apply directly to modern, competitive environments, where sustained progress and compound effects often determine long-term success more than individual achievements or temporary advantages. The lesson scroll of defeat that I maintained throughout my career became my most valuable educational resource, more precious than any victory chronicle because it contained the hard-won wisdom that only failure can teach. I learned that strategic failures are not obstacles to success. They are the raw material from which superior strategies are forged. If you have the courage to examine them honestly and the wisdom to extract their lessons. My most instructive failure occurred during what should have been a simple border consolidation campaign. I had successfully used similar strategies in comparable situations. My forces were well prepared and adequately supplied, and the opposition appeared manageable based on reliable intelligence. Every element suggested certain success, yet the campaign failed completely, costing me valuable resources and damaging my reputation significantly. The immediate causes of failure seemed random and unforeseeable: unexpected weather, equipment malfunctions, communication breakdowns, and opponent actions that contradicted their established patterns. My initial reaction was to attribute the failure to bad luck and circumstances beyond my control. This comfortable explanation protected my ego, but prevented any real learning from the experience. Only when I forced myself to conduct a brutally honest analysis did I discover the deeper patterns underlying the failure. The weather was unusual, but not unprecedented. I had simply ignored historical data that suggested such conditions were possible during that season. The equipment problems resulted from deferred maintenance that I had postponed to accelerate the campaign timeline. The communication failures occurred because I had not adequately tested new coordination procedures under stressful conditions. Most importantly, I realized that my opponent had not acted randomly at all. They had studied my previous campaigns and identified patterns in my strategic approach that allowed them to predict and counter my tactics. What I had attributed to luck was actually superior preparation by an adversary who understood my methods better than I understood theirs. This painful analysis taught me that strategic failures usually result from a combination of factors: flawed assumptions, inadequate preparation, and predictable patterns that opponents can exploit. The most dangerous failures are those that appear to result from external circumstances, because they discourage the self-examination necessary for improvement. I developed what I called the 5 questions of strategic learning to guide my analysis of every significant failure. The first question focused on assumption validation. Which of my planning assumptions proved incorrect, and how could I have tested them more rigorously beforehand? The second question examined preparation adequacy. What aspects of the situation was I inadequately prepared for, and what would better preparation have required? The third question analyzed pattern vulnerability. What predictable elements in my approach could opponents have exploited, and how could I have varied my methods to prevent such exploitation? The fourth question evaluated information quality. What critical information was missing, inaccurate, or misinterpreted during my planning process? The fifth question assessed psychological factors. How did my emotions, biases, or overconfidence contribute to poor strategic decisions? I learned that the most valuable failures are those that reveal systematic weaknesses rather than random misfortunes. A failure caused by bad weather teaches little about strategic improvement, but a failure caused by poor weather preparation reveals planning processes that can be enhanced for future campaigns. The discipline of learning from failure requires overcoming natural psychological resistance to acknowledging mistakes. Most people prefer to attribute failures to external circumstances rather than internal shortcomings, because this protects self-esteem while avoiding the uncomfortable work of genuine improvement. I discovered that failure analysis must be conducted quickly after events occur, while details are still fresh and emotions have not yet distorted memories. Delayed analysis often produces sanitized versions of events that are less useful for learning purposes. The ultimate goal of failure analysis is not self-flagellation, but systematic improvement. Each failure should generate specific changes in planning processes, preparation methods, or strategic approaches that reduce the likelihood of similar failures in future situations. I also learned that sharing failure lessons with subordinates creates organizational learning that prevents others from repeating the same mistakes. The most effective military units were those where commanders openly discussed their failures and extracted systematic lessons that improved overall strategic capabilities. The master strategist's jade tablets that I received upon completing my strategic education contained the highest principles of warfare, but it took me decades to understand their true meaning. These tablets taught me that the supreme excellence of strategic planning is not winning difficult battles, it is positioning yourself so skillfully that victory becomes inevitable without fighting at all. My comprehension of advanced strategic principles evolved through a confrontation with the most formidable opponent of my career, a general whose tactical brilliance and resource advantages should have guaranteed his victory over my smaller, less experienced forces. Traditional strategic thinking suggested that I should avoid direct confrontation and seek more favorable circumstances for engagement. Instead, I chose to apply what I had learned was the highest form of strategic art, making competition irrelevant through superior positioning. Rather than preparing to fight this opponent on terms that favored his strengths, I designed a strategy that made fighting unnecessary by addressing the underlying causes of our conflict more effectively than military victory could achieve. I studied the political and economic factors that had created our confrontation and realized that both of our rulers were responding to pressures that military action could not actually resolve. The real issues involved trade routes, resource access, and territorial security problems that could be solved through strategic partnership more effectively than through conquest. I initiated diplomatic communications not to negotiate terms of surrender or temporary truces, but to propose strategic arrangements that would give both sides more of what they actually wanted than military victory could provide. My opponent would gain secure access to resources his kingdom needed, while we would obtain trade advantages and security guarantees that were more valuable than territorial conquest. The negotiations required months of careful communication and trust building, during which both armies remained positioned for battle. However, the strategic framework I proposed gradually transformed our relationship from adversaries competing for limited resources into partners, creating expanded opportunities for mutual benefit. The conflict concluded without a single battle being fought, yet I achieved strategic objectives that military victory alone could never have provided. My opponent became an ally whose capabilities strengthened our position against common threats, while the resources that would have been consumed in warfare were redirected toward economic development that benefited both kingdoms. This experience taught me that the most sophisticated strategic thinking transcends traditional competitive frameworks entirely. Instead of seeking to defeat opponents, advanced strategy creates situations where former opponents become partners in achieving objectives that serve everyone's interests more effectively than competition could. I learned that this principle of transcendent strategy requires understanding the deeper purposes underlying apparent conflicts. Most competitive situations exist because parties are pursuing the same limited resources or opportunities through incompatible methods. Advanced strategic thinking identifies alternative approaches that create additional resources or opportunities, rather than simply redistributing existing ones. The application of transcendent strategy requires exceptional patience and sophisticated diplomatic skills. You must maintain strategic strength while pursuing partnership, demonstrate trustworthiness while protecting vital interests, and create mutual benefits without sacrificing strategic independence. I discovered that transcendent strategy often appears weak or naive to observers who think in purely competitive terms. However, this appearance can become a strategic advantage, as opponents may underestimate your capabilities, while you are actually gaining strategic positioning that makes their competitive efforts irrelevant. The most advanced practitioners of strategic thinking integrate all the principles I have shared into a unified approach that adapts fluidly to changing circumstances while maintaining consistent strategic direction. They understand when to apply force and when to seek partnership, when to compete directly and when to make competition irrelevant, when to act decisively and when to wait patiently for optimal conditions. These advanced principles require years of study and practical application to master fully. They represent the culmination of strategic thinking, where tactical brilliance serves larger strategic wisdom that seeks to create lasting solutions rather than temporary victories. The ultimate goal of advanced strategic thinking is not personal dominance, but sustainable success that strengthens your position while contributing to larger purposes that extend beyond immediate competitive objectives. This approach creates strategic resilience that endures through changing circumstances and generates lasting influence that transcends any individual campaign or initiative. Modern applications of these advanced principles can transform how you approach career development, business strategy, and personal relationships by identifying opportunities to create mutual benefits rather than engaging in zero-sum competition. The personal strategy compass that I now offer you represents the distillation of everything I have learned about strategic planning, adapted for the challenges you face in your modern world. While the battlefields have changed from ancient China to contemporary offices, the fundamental principles of strategic thinking remain as powerful today as they were 2,500 years ago. Your strategic planning system must begin with the same foundation that guided my military campaigns: honest assessment of your current position. Create your own version of the 5 mirrors of reality by conducting regular evaluations of your actual capabilities, resources, relationships, limitations, and motivations. Schedule monthly reviews, where you examine these elements without the comfortable distortions of wishful thinking or false modesty. Develop your environmental intelligence network by identifying the 3 most important trends affecting your field or industry. Cultivate relationships with people who can provide early insights into changes that will create new opportunities or threats. Most people react to environmental changes after they become obvious, but strategic advantage comes from anticipating shifts before your competitors recognize them. Build your personal intelligence gathering system by establishing multiple information sources for any critical decisions you face. Never rely on single sources for important strategic information. Whether you are evaluating career opportunities, market conditions, or competitive landscapes, develop the habit of validating assumptions through independent verification, rather than accepting convenient information that supports your preferred conclusions. Master the art of strategic positioning by regularly assessing not just where you are, but where everyone else in your competitive environment is positioned and why those positions matter. Before making any significant move, ask yourself, how does this change my strategic position relative to others? And what response options does this create or eliminate? Practice strategic timing by learning to recognize the natural rhythms and cycles that affect your goals. Whether you are planning career moves, business initiatives, or personal development projects, understand when conditions are most favorable for different types of actions. Develop the patience to wait for optimal timing rather than acting from impatience or external pressure. Implement systematic resource management by maintaining strategic reserves in every area of your life. Never commit all your time, energy, money, or attention to current projects, regardless of how promising they appear. Reserve 20% of your resources for unexpected opportunities or unforeseen challenges that will inevitably arise. Create adaptive planning processes that can evolve as circumstances change without losing strategic direction. Build multiple pathways to your objectives rather than single path plans that require complete reconstruction when conditions shift. Establish clear criteria for when adaptation is necessary and practice making strategic adjustments quickly and deliberately. Develop your strategic communication skills by learning to translate complex objectives into simple, actionable guidance that others can understand and implement effectively. Whether you are leading teams, building partnerships, or seeking support for your initiatives, success depends on your ability to create shared understanding and commitment around strategic objectives. Build strategic partnerships systematically by identifying people whose capabilities complement your strengths and whose success would enhance your strategic position. Focus on creating relationships where mutual benefit is genuine and sustainable rather than accumulating contacts for short-term advantage. Establish risk assessment protocols that help you identify potential problems before they become crises. For any significant initiative, spend time identifying what could go wrong, how different risks might interact, and what contingency options would be most valuable if challenges arise. Create momentum deliberately by choosing initial objectives that can generate psychological and material progress toward larger goals. Begin strategic initiatives with actions that are likely to succeed, and build toward more challenging objectives as momentum develops. Learn from every significant setback by conducting honest analysis of what went wrong and what you could do differently in similar situations. Maintain your own version of the lesson scroll of defeat to capture insights that will improve your future strategic planning. Practice these principles consistently through daily decisions and regular strategic reviews. Strategic thinking is a skill that develops through application, not just through study. The more you apply these principles to real situations, the more naturally they will become part of your decision-making process. The eternal strategy flame that burns before me as I share these final thoughts represents the timeless nature of strategic wisdom passed from teacher to student across millennia, adapted to new circumstances while preserving essential truths that govern success in any competitive environment. You now possess the same principles that guided emperors and generals, adapted for the challenges of your modern world. As I reflect on everything I have shared with you about the art of strategic planning, I want you to understand that these principles carry both great power and great responsibility. Strategic knowledge can transform your life, accelerate your progress toward meaningful goals, and help you navigate complex challenges with wisdom rather than mere effort. However, this knowledge also obligates you to use these capabilities thoughtfully and ethically. The strategic thinking I have taught you is not merely a collection of techniques for personal advancement. It is a way of understanding how complex systems work, how human behavior patterns create predictable opportunities, and how patient preparation can shape seemingly uncontrollable circumstances. This understanding makes you more effective in pursuit of your objectives, but it also makes you more aware of how your actions affect others. I challenge you to become a strategic thinker worthy of this ancient wisdom by applying these principles, not just for personal gain, but in service of purposes larger than immediate self-interest. The most satisfying victories are those that strengthen your position while contributing to outcomes that benefit others as well. Strategic mastery reaches its highest expression when it serves noble purposes rather than narrow ambitions. Remember that strategic thinking is a lifelong discipline, not a skill you master once and then apply mechanically forever. The principles I have shared with you are frameworks for thinking, not formulas for automatic success. Each situation you encounter will require fresh analysis, creative adaptation, and careful judgment about how to apply strategic principles to unique circumstances. Your strategic education has only begun with what I have taught you. Continue learning from every success and failure, from every opponent and ally, from every changing circumstance that tests your strategic capabilities. The greatest strategists are those who remain students throughout their lives, constantly refining their understanding and expanding their capabilities. Build upon the foundation I have provided by developing your own innovations and adaptations. The strategic challenges you face in your modern world are different from those I encountered on ancient battlefields, and some of your solutions will necessarily be different from mine. Honor my teachings by thinking independently while applying the principles I have shared. Pass this wisdom forward to others who can benefit from strategic thinking. The flame of strategic knowledge grows brighter when it is shared rather than hoarded. Teach these principles to teammates, colleagues, and anyone else who faces complex challenges that require more than effort and good intentions to resolve successfully. As you apply these strategic principles throughout your life, remember that the ultimate measure of strategic success is not the victories you achieve, but the person you become through pursuing worthy objectives with wisdom, patience, and ethical consideration for how your actions affect others. My journey as your teacher concludes here, but your journey as a strategic thinker is just beginning. May these ancient principles serve you well in creating the life you envision, achieving the goals that matter most to you, and contributing to purposes that extend beyond your immediate interests. The eternal strategy flame now passes to you. Guard it well, apply it wisely, and ensure that its light continues to illuminate the path for those who will follow after you. This is my final gift to you, and my lasting challenge. Become the strategic leader your potential promises and your world needs. Go forth with confidence, armed with timeless wisdom, and create your own legend of strategic excellence.